Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We do have a large number of registrants today, so we're just going to give it about 30 seconds and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so it appears that we do have critical mass. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Manager of Government Affairs, Jonas Murphy. Jonas, you have the floor.
Great, thanks, Jenny. And hi, everyone. Great to have you join us today. As Jenny mentioned, I'm Jonas Murphy with NVCA. Got a great panel of experts today to dive into the State Small Business Credit Initiative with focus on equity capital programs. We hope this can be a helpful session as you and your firms are potentially considering SSBCI funds during this critical period as states are standing up their programs. Just a quick housekeeping note, we encourage you to put any questions you have in the Q&A feature, and we'll be sure to leave plenty of time at the end to answer all of those. I'll just quickly ask our panelists to introduce themselves. Maybe starting with Carl, would you like to start us off?
Sure, Jonas, thanks. And thanks to your organization for sponsoring this and getting the platform. I'm Carl Fuchs. I'm with the U.S. Department of Treasury on the Small Business Credit Initiative team. I'm responsible for outreach for many of the states and also for coordinating the Treasury program with respect to equity investing.
Thanks, Carl. Eric?
Sure, Eric Cromwell. My firm's Cromwell Schmischer, and we are part of the contractor team that is supporting SSBCI as subject matter experts for equity capital programs. So happy to be here.
Thanks, Eric. And Jeff?
Good afternoon. I'm Jeff Stout. I'm the director of the State Small Business Credit Initiative, and also very happy to be here. Thanks for hosting.
Great, thanks, Jeff. And Jennifer?
I am Jennifer Teagan. I'm the managing director of the equity programs for the state of New York called New York Ventures, part of our Empire State Development Economic Development Agency there. And I'll be excited for this program, both the webinar today, but also obviously for the funds that will help our state to help lots of small businesses from lending to equity programs. Thank you for having me today.
Great. And maybe just to quickly level set on SSBCI, the program was reinstated with $10 billion as part of the American Rescue Plan. And it's intended to provide capital to small businesses and startups in overlooked regions and communities that can be used for either debt or equity investment programs. This is a substantial increase from the original iteration of the program, which was first created in 2010 and funded with $1.5 billion. Each state will receive a minimum of $56 million allocated by formula across 3 tranches. It could be used to either expand existing small business investment programs or create new programs, including equity capital programs, state capital access programs, collateral support, loan participation, and loan guarantee programs. So Treasury released program guidelines last November, and states have submitted their applications to Treasury for approval. So currently that's kind of where we are in the process. And then once approved, states will begin implementing the programs and allocating funds. Carl, Eric, or Jeff, any sort of context to add there, just from a high level view of the program?
Sure, I'll jump in for a minute. I think you covered it really well, Jonas. I'll just add that there are 2 basic components of the program. The capital, we refer to the capital component, which funds the equity investment programs and the credit support programs that you mentioned. That's roughly $9.5 billion out of the $10 billion. And then there's $500 million allocated for technical assistance directly to small businesses. So that's another piece of the program we may not touch on too much today because we're still developing the rules for that program. So we'll probably focus more on the capital itself. And then I'll just mention, this is really sort of a bottom-up program where jurisdictions bring their programs to Treasury in their applications based on the needs, their local economic development needs. And then Treasury reviews those applications. If they're compliant with the eligibility requirements, they're approved and the state is given an allocation of funding that's based on a formula in the statute, which you mentioned ranges from 50-some million dollars in the smallest jurisdictions to over $1 billion in California. We are currently reviewing applications from the states, territories, and District of Columbia, and roughly by their own design, the states have requested approximately 17% of the available funding, or $1.5 billion for venture capital fund programs. So where the state would actually invest as an LP, essentially in a fund, and then another $1.4 billion they propose to use in direct equity investment programs. So, for example, partnering with a venture development organization to make direct investments in businesses. So, just in summary, approximately 48 jurisdictions intend to operate some kind of equity program, and again, that's over $3 billion at this time that jurisdictions are proposing to use in these programs. We see this really as a historic opportunity to bring venture investment to non-traditional markets throughout the country, to support emerging fund managers, to expand the reach of VC to more minority-owned businesses, and really looking forward to working with you all and everyone on the phone to implement the program. So turn it back to you, Jonas.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Jeff. And Jennifer, if I could just turn to you briefly, from your perspective, kind of how are you thinking about SSBCI in terms of the impact on emerging ecosystems and emerging VC fund managers in these ecosystems that traditionally haven't seen a lot of VC activity?
So I can address that from a couple of standpoints. I didn't mention in my introduction that the original SSBCI program, I was a fund manager prior to joining New York State. And so some of my remarks and comments will be based on my experience from the original program, not so much obviously on the new one, which is still being set up and structured. But yeah, so as far as, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Will you ask me the question again, Jonas?
Yeah, so how are you, just generally speaking, how are you, from your perspective, viewing SSBCI in terms of its potential impact on emerging ecosystems and these emerging fund managers that may receive access to a substantial amount of capital moving forward now?
Yeah, so certainly excitingly, the program this time around is very focused on socially and economically disadvantaged individuals. And so the structure, everybody is very incentivized by Treasury to propose programs and to use that capital to be able to affect and impact those communities. And so, from our standpoint, the state of New York has already, done a lot and is very focused on that anyway. So we're super excited to be able to have additional resources and additional capital to be able to further support, particularly emerging managers in our state, which we haven't had access to capital to do previously. But also, when it comes to access to capital, we also see it through a geographic lens, not just a diversity lens. And so we want to make sure that in New York State, if you're a founder in Potsdam, that you have as good of access to capital as you do if you're in Brooklyn. So, those two lenses and the opportunity to be able to support all entrepreneurs of all backgrounds across the state and even in diverse industries is super exciting. Plus, we know from the prior program that the impact was great. We created well over 2,000 jobs. The return on that fund, on the original fund, was excellent for us, and it's continued to pay dividends forward to other entrepreneurs who are continuing to grow and start companies in New York State, and to hopefully increase the vibrancy of the overall innovation ecosystem across the entire state.
Great, thank you. So we'll now turn to the program guidelines that I mentioned were released by Treasury last fall. We've heard from a number of folks who have questions about these guidelines, so we'll just try to cover some of the common themes that we've heard. To start off on the issue of fees, the guidelines allow for a 1.71% average over 10 years of program funds to be used for fees. Often in the earlier years of a fund, before returns have been generated, venture funds rely more on basically fees are the only source of revenue for a fund to cover expenses and operating costs. And so a lot of questions around if the percentage that could be assessed for fees could be higher in the earlier years of a fund and then come down in the later years, so long as the average is 1.71%. Any guidance on that?
Yeah, so thanks, Jonas. In addition to the capital guidelines that you mentioned that came out in November, Treasury has published updates to that, which we call FAQs, and those are also posted on our website. And these FAQs often delve into some of these specific issues. And so there were one released in December and one released in just today, in fact, on the website. And so in these FAQs, the one released today, we did address this issue of the 1.71 average. And the intent is to allow some variation in the level of fees paid over the life of the fund, so long as on average, as you look at the fund life over 10 years, the number stays below 1.71% of the contribution by the SSBCI program. And again, these are meant to cover, broadly speaking, the services that the fund manager uses to support the equity portfolio. So attendance, board meetings, introductions to investors and potential employees, maybe customers, all the things that they do to work to create value in their portfolio companies. We recognize the need to support these activities as part of the equity investing apparatus of the fund.
Thank you, Carl. Very helpful. Moving on to the next issue here, we heard from a number of folks who would like some clarity around the expended, transferred, and obligated definitions. What counts as expended funds, obligated funds, and transferred funds. Can you shed some light on those definitions?
Sure. So the reason for these definitions and the importance to the state programs, come from the fact that, as you stated in the beginning, the SSBCI allocation to each state comes in 3 separate tranches or draws. And so they get it 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3. And they receive the first third at the beginning of the program once their application is approved. And then they qualify to draw their second, to get their second draw once they can demonstrate that 80% of the first draw was used for small business investing or lending. And the requirement there is that 80% must be expended, transferred, or obligated to transactions to small businesses. And that's why states are focused on this, because they have 3 years from the initial start of the program to satisfy that criteria and draw their second tranche. And if they fail to do that within the 3-year period, they may be in danger of losing access to the remaining funds. So expended funds in the context of equity investing is fairly straightforward. It's whatever has actually been expended, invested into companies, and that's easily documented and tracked. Transfers are really just the step before that expenditure. So, monies could have been transferred to an entity prior to actually executing or closing on an investment. But if they have received a capital call or a notification that that expenditure is imminent and the capital needs to be transferred, then that transfer will also qualify under the 80% requirement. And the obligated one is for contracts that clearly obligate the state program to fund future capital calls or capital deployments. So these are for any type of contract in which the state clearly, is required on notification to transfer the funds over, and they have no other ability to redirect those funds to other uses. And so those funds become segregated out, become obligated, and we would consider those to be effectively deployed for the 80% purposes. So those are the 3 different types of categories, an actual transfer, actual expenditure, a transfer in anticipation of an imminent expenditure, or a contract that obligates a portion of the capital to all future expenditures, under very clear guidelines and requirements.
Great, thank you. Can you describe some of the the rules around using SSBCI funds to invest in existing portfolio companies or where there's a prior financial interest. I understand there are different rules depending on the type of entity. Be really helpful if you could just walk through some of that.
Yeah, so it would be helpful for people to understand that under the SSBCI program, there is a focus on maintaining transparency and openness. And so the conflict of interest rules are quite clear. And unlike perhaps in private markets where there is some room to cure conflict of interest issues through either an advisory committee approval or some other process, under SSBCI, any transaction that's deemed to be within the conflict of interest definition is prohibited, and there is no ability to cure it. It just cannot take place. And so the primary way to think about these conflict of interests is SSBCI capital cannot be invested into any company in which a manager or someone who has influence over the direction of the SSBCI capital has a prior personal financial interest. And so this would extend to, I think, what's termed crossover investing. So if a new fund is capitalized and SSBCI participates, if that fund wanted to invest in a portfolio company of a prior fund of that manager as a follow-on round of capital, that would not be allowed. So because the fund manager is considered to be someone who directs and controls the allocation of SSBCI capital, they would have a prior financial interest in that portfolio company, and therefore that would not be an allowable transaction. However, our guidance does allow for follow-on investing in the same portfolio company by that manager. So when a fund makes a first round investment in a company and then perhaps sits on the board, when they come to make a second round of investing, that is permitted so long as the first one, that personal financial interest was created by the investment of SSBCI capital in the first place. So in that instance, follow-on investing in the portfolio company of the same fund would be allowable. The instance, I think, which you're mentioning, Jonas, where crossover investing may be permitted are only by state-sponsored nonprofits. These are legislatively created entities that states have to manage their investment or financing programs. So these state vehicles, if they are implementing a venture or equity program, are allowed to do crossover investing in portfolio companies where they may have invested prior state funds or made other arrangements. So, but that exemption would not cover any private fund manager of SSBCI capital.
Got it. Thank you. Very, very helpful. Another issue is around the SETI definition, or socially or economically disadvantaged individual. And there was some questions around the ownership threshold there. The guidelines state that in order to qualify as a SETI investment, the founder's ownership prior to the first investment must be 51% or higher. As many of you know, ownership percentages held by founders of VC-backed companies often fall below 50%, just given subsequent rounds of financing and employee incentives. And so there's some concern that this requirement may disadvantage these enterprises from securing the equity capital they need to scale. And so can that SETI qualification hold through the duration of investment, even if the founder's ownership position falls below 50% after subsequent rounds of financing?
Yeah, so that was addressed in the FAQ that was released today. And the determination there by Treasury is that the 51% threshold must be based on the condition of the company at the time the investment is consummated. So, or just before. So, it's the prior holding just before SSBCI capital is invested. So that implies that the second round of financing, if that threshold drops below 51% of SETI ownership, would not qualify as a SETI transaction for the state program. The state program is still free to invest in that company. Just that particular transaction would no longer count towards their objective of deploying monies to SETI companies. So unfortunately, that has been the determination, and the SETI characterization will not carry through, as you mentioned, based on the first transaction. It will be very much a transaction-specific evaluation.
Gotcha. Thank you. On the incubation fund model, there seems to be a lot of technical components to this, and I think it'd be helpful if you just walk us through that model and kind of what it's intended to solve for and kind of how it's structured, et cetera.
Yeah, so the incubation funding model and its associated early stage investor model, these are terms that Treasury put into its guidelines. And the intent there was to focus program participants on the gap in many state ecosystems for very early stage investing, primarily in underserved markets. So we wanted to highlight an opportunity to link incubator, accelerator-like services, so services that help to make companies or entrepreneurs investable, and link them with providers of capital at that early stage of funding. So the incubation funding model is a fund-based characterization, and the early stage investor model is a direct investor type of approach. And so the direct investor approach is anticipating involvement primarily by angel investors or others who are natural participants at early stage investing in the ecosystem. So what that allows for is under SSBCI, equity investors generally have to be pari passu, so private investors need to be pari passu with the state portion of the funding. And that means any downside or any upside potential needs to be equally shared on a pro rata basis. What these two exceptions are is to allow the state program to participate out some of the upside they receive on the investing activity. And so that participation can be all the upside or a portion of the upside, depending on how the state wants to incentivize and allocate that upside sharing. And the sharing mechanism is accomplished through a call option. So what we envision is that, for example, in the fund investment model, the fund manager and the LPs would be granted a call option by the state limited partner. And the call option would allow the LPs or the fund to buy out the state's LP position at some point during the term of the call option at a specified strike price. So the strike price could be at the basis of the investment, or it could be at 2 times multiple of the investment, or it could be some variation, along that spectrum. And so in this way, we're hoping that, that additional economic incentive might attract experienced investors to participate at this early stage of investing. And to accomplish that, the investments that qualify for this investment are restricted to the first SSBCI investment that goes into the company. And the total amount of SSBCI capital that can be invested in that first investment is $125,000, so up to $125,000 in a round that cannot exceed $375,000. So this is clearly, meant to be, one of the very first capital raises of companies at a very early stage. And the companies that are recipients of this investing must also have benefited from these incubator or accelerator-like services that have made them investable or ready to receive investment. And so those are the, it's somewhat technical and complicated to explain in this way, but it's really to try to marry these incubator-like services in ecosystems with experienced investors at that earliest stage of investing to try to bring very good investors into the ecosystem at that level.
Very helpful. Thank you. On regional and multi-state partnerships, there's a provision which allows state-sponsored venture capital programs to participate in multi-state fund structures. We've heard that multi-state partnerships might be helpful for allowing greater collaboration across the region that can drive better outcomes. So can you kind of walk us through some of the guidelines here? Is there anything that folks should know in particular about regional and multi-state partnerships?
Yeah, so there's no restriction on multiple states contributing capital to the same fund. The only consideration states and fund managers should take under consideration is under SSBCI, one of the underlying philosophies is to be catalytic in the attraction of private capital. We want to, in the terminology of SSBCI, we want to crowd in private capital to these transactions. And so there's a requirement at the fund level that there be at least 50% participation by the private sector. So to the extent there are multiple states participating in a fund, the state contribution would be public in character. These would be public funds. And so they need to be balanced with an equal or larger amount of private capital. So that's the first consideration. The second consideration would be there is a geographic restriction in SSBCI guidelines for state programs where only 10% of the total allocated amount of capital to that state can be invested outside the state. And so the fund manager would have to be able to track, trace, and report on the portfolio investments going across state lines. And so every state will have to be notified and reported on where their capital has been invested so they can make sure they stay within the compliance of the 10% budget that they have to invest out of state. So long as funds stay within that 1-to-1 minimum of private capital to public capital, and so long as the fund reporting allows states to monitor and comply with their geographic restriction on investing, there should be no issues with multiple states participating in a single fund to provide either economies of scale or adequate reach across the universe of portfolio companies.
Great. In terms of participation for tribal governments, I know there are some separate guidelines around that. Can you kind of walk us through some of those guidelines, kind of special considerations for tribal governments?
Yeah, so our understanding of tribal government environments, there are three broad areas. I believe, maybe there's a few more, but the three broad areas with respect to equity that are important is what is the determination of private capital in these different ecosystems in tribal lands, number one. Number two, what is the conflict of interest regime in these areas? And third, what is the geographic reach of a tribal government? So those are the three broad areas where there's a little bit of departure for how the program is administered relative to state and territories. So for the first one, for private capital, the typical approach for state and territories is to have private capital restricted to only sources of investment coming from private entities. But in tribal environments, we understand that many of the partners available to be co-investors or supporters of transactions are jointly owned tribal enterprises. And so, there's some element of, non-private from the strict definition in the nature of the capital that they have. And so what we have defined as private capital in the tribal government context is any revenue that a tribal enterprise has derived from commercial activities. So for example, many tribal enterprises are engaged with casino operations or may have leasing contracts or may operate other businesses that generate revenue from normal commercial activity. So these sources of capital would be able to be considered private capital for the purposes of that 1-to-1 match that I talked about. So that's an important carve out for the tribal government environments. So the second one was the conflict of interest. So as I mentioned, conflict of interest under SSBCI is an important context because, these transactions cannot be cured, and so they need to be highlighted, understood, and kept out of the program. So under the tribal government context, conflict of interest will be driven by the tribal government's conflict of interest regime. Because again, in the tribal government context, there may be a lot of related party type relationships, coming out of the way these governments and tribal enterprises are structured. So we would leave it to that tribal government to determine what the conflict of interest regime that they have, and that would be the requirement. And I think there's a second portion of that where those transactions would then have to be disclosed. So long as they meet those requirements, they would be in compliance with the conflict of interest administration rules. And then the third area would be the geographic determination. What is the footprint of a tribal government to determine this 10% allocation to outside of their jurisdiction. So many recognized tribal entities do not necessarily have physical lands that they control. And so the definition of jurisdiction or the geographic footprint is broader for these tribal governments. So it encompasses any tribal enterprise but owned by tribal members. It encompasses states, businesses in states where tribal members reside. So, that's a very broad footprint that these tribal entities have to consider as their home base for investing.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think that was all the issues that I had on my list here. Are there any other issues from the guidelines or just general technical issues that you think we should cover for the group?
Yeah, I think one of the important ones, particularly for the fund programs that we are supporting with the SSBCI capital, is this time around, there is a requirement that states in their application indicate that they will have approaches to investing in funds that make their investment catalytic in the formation of those funds. And so this gets to, again, one of the principles of SSBCI. We want to cause and result or crowd in this private capital. And so one of the ways that a state can demonstrate that it has been catalytic in the formation and attraction of capital to a fund is to participate prior to the initial close of a fund. And so that is, one approach that many states will take. It may be more difficult for them to participate after the initial close. Number one, because they would have to find, reasons other than helping a fund reach its initial close as reasons for their catalytic involvement in the fund. But also, secondly, once a fund has reached its initial close and is in the process of either final close or its other closings, it will be investing, and it may have portfolio companies at the time SSBCI capital comes in, if it comes in at a later date. And the earlier invested portfolio companies would not have been certified as SSBCI qualified portfolio companies. And this goes to this other issue, which we didn't touch on, that as transactions are closed with SSBCI capital involvement, they need to be certified. There's several certifications that need to be provided at time of closing or prior to closing for them to be compliant with the administering regime. And so, that's just going to be another complication for potential state program LPs to participate with funds at later closings. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Thank you. Very helpful. So we've covered a lot of the technical issues with SSBCI and wanted to spend a little bit of time discussing kind of best practices for VCs who are considering SSBCI funds. What are the issues that should be top of mind for them? It could be with respect to the program guidelines, reporting requirements. I'll just open it up to the panel here. Maybe Jennifer, if you'd like to start us off on this.
For sure. So one of the things that I appreciated about the New York State, how it structured the program last time around, and this is something I'm planning to do now that I'm responsible for it this time, is that the reporting was very, I mean, it was dense, but it was very straightforward. So, you know, as Carl mentioned a minute ago, there's a certification process that each investment has to go through. And, you know, it doesn't have to be difficult to do it if it's structured well, as to, you know, what needs to be certified and what needs to be, what attestations you need to get from the company. So the more forethought that the states who are managing these programs put into how that's delivered, how that's structured, how that's you know, returned back to the people at the state who are managing it with you, the better it is for everybody, and the more straightforward it is, because, you know, it is definitely a program that has certain restrictions that need to be dealt with. It doesn't need to be onerous if it's done well. I certainly didn't find it onerous last time, and I'm hopeful that I can make it not very onerous this time around too for those companies. And so I don't know, Eric and Dan, you may have some comments on this as well.
And maybe just kind of take a step back too. I know a lot of the audience comes from different perspectives of managing funds, and maybe some entrepreneurs, and then kind of what they're expecting here. And just remember, for context, SSBCI, the value of it is that it allows the states to create different strategies that are then approved by Treasury. And so then the other side of that, the challenge for investors and entrepreneurs, is that you really then have to go state by state to understand what is the specific strategy being implemented by that state. And then Carl did a good job of talking through some of the requirements and details that Treasury has put forward on the program. States may have a little bit different angle on that. So they have to adopt what Treasury mandates, but then they may add a few more expectations. And so as you think about participation, now that the applications are in by the states and moving through the review process, whatever point in time that you can get information on what the state is doing, I would encourage anyone who wants to participate as an investor, co-investor, small business investee, to make sure you not only understand the Treasury's requirements, but dig into the state relationship side to make sure there are some things or not some things that they have also included in those requirements. So it's kind of twofold. I don't want to sound like it's too burdensome, because I don't think it is, but it is important to understand both the Treasury regulations and then also what the state does.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on this topic?
So I was just going to talk a little bit about the alignment of incentives and goals that I think is super important for this program for it to be effective and for it to meet what Treasury's guidance is. You know, so not only for your state program, but also for what Treasury is expecting and hoping to get out of it. So I think that that's an important part of the structuring of the initial program is, you know, if you want to see more diverse managers in your state, to make sure that you're accessing those communities in a way that will allow you to get the capital in their hands, but also, again, in the structuring of that program and how they're being incentivized to use that capital, that it's very clear at the outset of what you're trying to accomplish with those funds, and ultimately what Treasury is trying to accomplish. And I think that the more that the states can, I mean, and Eric is right, like, you know, our legislature in New York State puts certain restrictions on how we can use the capital. So we have to not only address what Treasury is telling us, but what New York State is telling us how we can use those funds. Fortunately, our legislature has been fairly flexible with that. So I'm grateful for that. I've talked to a few other states where that isn't the case. So to the extent that the states can influence, you know, the flexibility of, and the alignment, the flexibility of how they can use those funds, as long as it's aligned with how Treasury is allowing them to do it, and the incentives that are there, is also something really helpful to think through at this point in time. Because when you're starting to look at the private sector, the more restrictive that you make the monies or the way that they use them and how they use them, it gets complicated pretty quickly. It will make it more burdensome to administer it, and it will also make it less attractive for some of those private sector partners to work with you. And having been on the other side of in the private sector for most of my career, it's certainly, the money is attractive, but working with the states and working with the public sector is not always attractive to the private sector. And you want to make sure that you're attracting, funds that have, both not only the emerging managers, if that's your goal, but also the fund managers that do have depth of experience who can really help you to guide and develop a program that will have the impact that you want it to have in your state. And then the other point I would just make is, to the extent that you can, in terms of the pipeline development of the opportunities, certainly connecting with your partners across the state at universities, at accelerators, at incubators, at the entrepreneurship assistance centers that might be, present in the various regions of your state, kind of getting all of those people on board and aware of what you're doing and what the programs are that that you've already proposed, so that they can begin to help you with the marketing of that to people who are interested in what you're doing, the better. It's a great time to do that right now while we're all waiting to hear back from Treasury on our applications.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. So with that, I think I wanted to leave a lot of time at the end for questions. We have quite a few here to go to. Let me see here. Maybe just to start off, how can entrepreneurs and small business founders access these funds? Do they need to be registered in a state? Can a Delaware C Corp with a base address in New Jersey, for example, apply?
I think that goes a little bit to, and I'm sure Carl wants to jump in, that goes a little bit to kind of my explanation of it is a state-by-state program management responsibility. So when a company, it may be registered in Delaware as a C Corp or an LLC or whatever, but there's going to be a definition here about what is a resident business in that state. And so that entrepreneur, that business should then go to the state program to find out what are they doing, how are they deploying capital, what does the support system look like, and then engage in that way. So it really is a state by state process for the investors and the entrepreneurs to work through.
Yeah, I'll add that, every state, will structure their programs differently. And so a state may be the applicant to the Treasury program, and the Treasury will allocate funding to that state, but then the state will have an underlying contract or relationship and will transfer those funds perhaps to a private nonprofit entity to run the program for them. And so the state itself would not be taking any applications. It would be that private nonprofit entity that would be the investor in that particular community, and they would be the ones to take potential company applications and make investment decisions in that company. So there's going to be a wide degree of variation as to which entity will be responsible for deploying the capital. And as Eric said, you would have to sort of look at each state to understand how its SSBCI program is structured. For fund investing, many states will either go through an RFP process, so they will receive funding from Treasury, and then they will have an RFP process to select funds, or an RFI process, or some public process to be able to notify the community of the opportunity to screen and then select funds for investing. So there's a variation both on the direct investing side and the fund investing side that are going to be very idiosyncratic to each state program.
This is Jeff, I would just add that just for context where we are in the process, the states are applying, Treasury is reviewing. It's likely to be some months before it's clear and public who these entities are, who the contractors and funds are that the states are working with. And as those things become available, we will post that information, who's received the allocations and who the state is partnering with. We're committed to trying to make that as transparent as possible, as I know the states are, so they can develop the best pipeline of investments they can.
Great. So another question, does Treasury have a standard side letter or a template for fund managers that cover various issues, including investment limitations, reporting requirements, fees, conflicts, et cetera?
No, we do not have templates for that. Again, that's specific to each state program.
Great. So given the private fund leverage targets of the program, do you have any thoughts on how best to provide equity funding to non-innovation focused or tech focused firms?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the question is on private fund leverage and the connection to, are they saying there are no private investors interested in that class of companies? Is that the question?
We can follow up separately on that one. Let's see here. Can you speak to strategies or best practices for investing in SETI founders while abiding by civil rights requirements, non-discrimination based on race, sex, et cetera? Any thoughts on that one?
I'm not a civil rights expert. What Treasury has done in trying to define what a SETI transaction, SETI compliant transaction would be under SSBCI. If you read the capital guidelines released in November, there's a broad set of requirements that a business or an entrepreneur can meet to qualify as a SETI investment. And not all of them are demographic related data points. Some of them are geographic. So if the business falls within a certain geographic area or the entrepreneurs reside in a certain geographic area, they would also comply. So we're hopeful that this broader definition of a SETI compliant transaction would not create any issues for investors or state programs.
Thank you. Does the 1.7% average fee include both management fees and fund partnership expenses? How is carried interest viewed by Treasury?
Yeah, so the 1.71 is not strictly devoted to management fees. It's an arrangement that the state program and the fund manager comes to. So this has to be separately documented, either in a side letter or as part of the fund agreement. So the 1.71 is to cover the services that a fund manager will provide to portfolio companies. And that would be, the range of what it can cover. We would expect that state programs, would not pay more than any other LP in a fund. And we would hardly expect a fund manager that would allow them to pay less. So, we're understanding that there are other fund expenses outside of these types of services to portfolio companies. And states do have access to what's considered administrative funds. So this is a basket of funds available to them under the program, which they can use to pay for support services. So states could choose to pay some of the other fund expenses that are not covered by services to portfolio companies from that basket of funding, or they may have state funds available to them to pay for those other expenses as well. So it will be up to, the fund expense profile of a particular limited partner investment, how much the 1.71 covers and whether there's any other expenses that need to be also considered as part of that investment.
Great. We've received a number of questions just asking, generally speaking, is there a sort of list of organizations that on a state level are going to be responsible for implementing their SSBCI programs, kind of a centralized resource for folks to go to?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we don't have a list like that. Number one, because no applications have been approved yet, so there are no currently operating SSBCI programs. What we can say is that, all 50 states and territories were eligible applicants and all of them submitted applications. Once the programs are approved, it will be up to the state to, again, make available to its community, how to access and who to access for this funding. So again, this is very much a state-centered program, and we encourage people to develop relationships with the state SSBCI program people to understand how that program is going to roll out.
And real quick, Jonas, I mean, I think that's right from Treasury's perspective. I will say that I've seen a few press releases and announcements and different communications that are being issued by governor's offices around the country. And so depending on what state you're in, you might just kind of keep an eye out for that kind of correspondence, where a state might say, we have now submitted our application to the US Treasury, and here's what we intend to do. And here's the organization within state government responsible. So, I think there's going to be some time before Treasury compiles that kind of communication, but state by state, they may be already doing for it if you look for that in whatever your jurisdiction is.
Great. Thanks, Eric. A number of questions about the terms for SSBCI funds. So, for example, do the SSBCI funds receive the same term sheet conditions as the private funds? Are the SSBCI funds equity dilutive or non-dilutive? Any thoughts on those questions?
Our expectation is that for fund investing, that the state programs will participate as limited partners, pari passu and pro rata with all the other limited partners in a fund. There may be other structures that states come up with, and we'll review them in the application review process to determine whether or not they are in compliance with SSBCI guidelines. But irrespective of whether they're in compliance with SSBCI guidelines, I mean, the private investment community needs to accept their capital in whatever form they're going to contribute it. So we would think that since the program intent is to attract and be catalytic in bringing private capital to these markets, that they will try to work closely with this community to incentivize them to participate.
Great. How do you define I guess, is this a state-by-state definition, or is there a universal definition in terms of an in-state company? Do you have to have 51% of employees working in a state? How is that defined as a company is located in X state?
Yeah, it's been broadly highlighted in guidelines as a company headquartered in the state. But we are coming out with, again, these FAQs, so there'll be a further clarification of the intent of that definition in guidelines. So that should be coming out for us pretty soon. I mean, it's been developed, and we understand we've had some amount of feedback from states requesting clarification on that. So please be on the lookout for a new FAQ sometime in the future that will determine what that definition is.
Gotcha. Is the program first come, first serve? Is there an expiration, or just when the funds have been entirely allocated?
Yeah, so again, this is up to states, but as I mentioned, they receive the funding in 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 increments. And so as they qualify for their next third, they'll be redeploying capital. So, it will come in stages, and they may, have a plan to go after certain segments of the market with their first stage, and then another section of the market with the second stage. Be up to their deployment strategy. Number two, we've seen over time that states, while engaging with the private market, understand that some transaction structures are more favorable than others, or more welcomed by the private market than others. And they do amend and adjust their programs to allocate perhaps more capital to programs that are attracting more response, and away from programs that are not attracting any response. So again, they may change their deployment strategy over time. And three, as capital is returned to the states during the term of the SSBCI program, they are still required to redeploy those monies along the same rules and guidelines as the SSBCI program. So this is called recycling in the SSBCI terminology. So we would expect that, if programs do get early returns and have capital building up from these transactions that they will seek to reinvest these. And so there'll be another round of deployment. So there's, going to be a timeline, in which for many years that this capital will be deployed and people have opportunities to participate.
Great. And I think we have time for maybe one more question. Any timeline updates on the technical assistance program, in both whether the program will be expanded to apply to emerging VC fund managers and not just companies? So I guess two parts to that question: timeline and any possibility of broadening the definition.
I'm glad we have Jeff here today. I'll let him address those questions.
So the technical assistance guidelines are in clearance at Treasury. There's an interagency review process that usually takes several weeks. So I would expect, we hope that it will go out not too much longer than a month from now. The deadline for applications June 30th, if I'm not mistaken. So, and in terms of the definitions, I can't really comment on that before the application or before the guidance comes out.
Sure. Thank you. So with that, we're just out of time here. I apologize if we weren't able to get to your question during the session, but I will be in touch with everybody individually who we did not get to. We'll be in touch as well with the recording of the session with my contact information. If you'd like to follow up with any further questions, more than happy to connect. But I hope this has been helpful for you all as you're considering engaging with SSBCI. Thanks so much to our terrific panelists. Really appreciate your expertise here. And thanks so much. Please stay in touch.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.